My name is Emma Carter. I am 34 years old, a massage therapist and yoga instructor who spends her days easing tension out of other people's shoulders. And on the afternoon my father's will was read, I sat in a lawyer's office holding an old leather suitcase that smelled like machine oil and watched my brother's face curdle into something I had never seen on him before. The suitcase was scuffed at every corner, the brass latches dulled with age, and it had belonged to my father for as long as I could remember. Inside, everyone assumed, were nothing but his watchmaker's tools, the small dented instruments he had used for 40 years, repairing timepieces in the back room of a shop that no longer existed. My brother Ryan received the house, the investment accounts, and what remained of my father's savings, a sum the lawyer read aloud as $210,000. I received the suitcase. Ryan laughed once, short and disbelieving, then looked at me like I had somehow orchestrated my own humiliation. "That's it," he said. "That's actually it. Dad left you a box of screwdrivers." I did not laugh. I sat very still with the suitcase balanced on my knees, its worn handle cool under my palm, and felt something my brother clearly did not feel in that moment. A quiet certainty that my father had never done anything without a reason. Not once in his entire meticulous, deliberate life. I want to tell you how we got to that office, because the suitcase sitting on my knees that afternoon was the end of one story and the beginning of another, and neither one makes sense without the other. To understand my family, you have to understand my father first. Robert Carter spent 41 years repairing watches in a narrow shop on Kessler Street, the kind of place with a bell over the door and a smell of oil and old velvet that never quite left his clothes. He was not a wealthy man by any conventional measure. He drove the same sedan for 18 years, wore suits he had owned since the 80s, and never once, in my entire childhood, raised his voice. But he was precise in every other way, the kind of man who wrote dates on the backs of photographs and kept receipts organized by year in a filing cabinet nobody else in the family ever opened. My mother died when I was 22, a sudden cardiac event that left my father quieter than he already was. And after that, the household split cleanly into two very different orbits. Ryan, 3 years older than me, moved into a role I can only describe as heir apparent, the son who talked business with my father over dinner, who asked about investments with the casual confidence of someone who assumed those conversations were partly about him already. I moved into massage therapy after a brief and unhappy stint in marketing, and my father never once made me feel small for it. Though Ryan did quietly, in the small comments that accumulate over years until you stop noticing them individually. "You could always come work at the shop," my father used to say to me, half joking, though I understood even then that it wasn't entirely a joke. I had spent childhood afternoons at that workbench, handed magnifying loupes and tiny screwdrivers, watching him coax dead watches back into motion with a patience I never fully inherited but always admired. Ryan, by contrast, had tried working at the shop for exactly one summer at 17 and left convinced that watch repair was, in his words, a dying man's hobby, not a real career. He went into sales instead, then real estate, then a string of business ventures that always seemed to require one more infusion of capital before they finally paid off. I loved my brother, and I did not go looking for a villain in my own family. I simply watched him, over the better part of a decade, ask my father for money with increasing frequency, and watch my father give it to him, quietly, without ever mentioning the amounts to me. I did not know the full scope of it until much later. What I knew, in the years before my father died, was smaller and more circumstantial. A car that appeared in Ryan's driveway that he could not plausibly have afforded on his own income. A comment my father made once, almost to himself, about how a father's job never really ends. A tension under every family dinner, a sense that Ryan needed something from our father that never quite got named out loud. My father's health began declining 18 months before he died, a slow accumulation of small failures. First his knees, then his heart, then a diagnosis that gave us a timeline instead of an ending. I moved back into a more active role during that time, driving him to appointments between client sessions, sitting with him on evenings when the house felt too large and too quiet for one aging man alone in it. Ryan visited less than I did, always with an excuse that sounded reasonable in isolation. A work trip, a client emergency, a scheduling conflict that somehow recurred with troubling consistency. During one of those quiet evenings, perhaps 4 months before he died, my father said something that I filed away without fully understanding, the way you do with sentences that only make sense in retrospect. "Emma," he said, "if anything ever seems unfair after I'm gone, give it time before you decide what it means." I asked him what he meant by that. He just patted my hand and changed the subject, the way he always did when a conversation had gotten closer to something real than he wanted it to. He died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, quietly, in his sleep, the kind of death people call peaceful, and that never actually feels peaceful to the people left behind. The funeral was small, exactly as he would have wanted. A handful of old customers from the shop, a few neighbors, Ryan's wife Ashley beside him in a black dress that looked new, and me, standing slightly apart, holding a program with my father's photograph on the front. The only one where he looked like he was about to smile at some private joke. The will reading happened 2 weeks later in a small conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner and stale coffee. The lawyer, David Whitman, a careful, soft-spoken man who had handled my father's affairs for over a decade, read through the document with the flat, practiced cadence of someone who had delivered difficult news in that room many times before. The house went to Ryan, along with the investment accounts and what remained of the liquid savings. The $210,000 that made Ryan visibly relax the moment the number left David's mouth. "To Emma," David continued, reading directly from the page, "I leave my tools and the case that holds them, along with everything contained inside it." That was it. That was my entire inheritance, according to the words on that page. A suitcase. Ryan's reaction was immediate and sharp, the kind of reaction that comes from someone who has spent years assuming a certain outcome and finds the actual outcome insulting by comparison, even when the actual outcome objectively favors him. "That's it," he said again, looking at David rather than at me, like there was some clerical error waiting to be corrected. "She gets a box of tools and I get everything else. That doesn't seem strange to you?" David did not react to the tone, the way lawyers who have seen every possible family reaction learn not to react. "The will is quite specific," he said simply. "Your father was very deliberate about the language." I sat there with the suitcase on my knees, feeling the weight of my brother's eyes on me, and something in my chest that I can only describe as a strange, unearned calm. I did not feel cheated. I felt instead the echo of my father's voice from that quiet evening months earlier. "If anything ever seems unfair, give it time before you decide what it means." I did not know yet how right that instinct would turn out to be. We left the office separately that afternoon, Ryan already on his phone before he reached the parking lot, Ashley trailing behind him with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between sympathy and something colder. I drove home with the suitcase belted into the passenger seat like a person, which felt strange and also, somehow, exactly right. I did not open it that first night. I set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time, running my fingers along the worn leather edges, remembering afternoons at my father's workbench, the smell of oil and brass polish, the particular satisfaction of watching a stopwatch begin ticking again under his careful hands. I told myself I would go through it properly on the weekend, when I had time to actually sit with whatever was inside, instead of rushing through it, exhausted after a full day of client sessions. That decision, to wait, mattered more than I could have understood at the time. Ryan called me 4 days after the will reading, his voice carrying a warmth that felt slightly manufactured, the tone he used when he wanted something and had decided that charm was the most efficient route to getting it. "Hey," he said. "I've been thinking about you, actually. About the suitcase." I told him I hadn't gone through it yet. "That's actually what I wanted to talk about," he said. "I feel bad about how that whole thing went down at David's office. I know it probably felt like Dad valued you less, and that's not fair. I was thinking maybe I could come by this weekend, and we could go through it together. There might be some of Dad's old records in there, too. Receipts, shop paperwork, stuff that might matter for taxes on the estate. I could help you sort what's actually valuable from what's just clutter. I was grieving, I was tired, and some old, deeply grooved part of me, the part that had spent a childhood watching Ryan get treated as the more important sibling, wanted very badly to believe that my brother was extending an olive branch, that grief had softened something between us that had been hard for years. "Sure," I said. "That would be nice, actually." We agreed on Saturday afternoon. I want you to understand that I did not, at that point, suspect anything. I was simply a grieving daughter, looking forward to sharing a quiet task with her brother. The kind of ordinary domestic moment that families are supposed to have, and that mine rarely did. Saturday arrived overcast and mild. Ryan showed up at 11 with 2 coffees, one of which he handed me with a small, almost bashful smile, an oat milk latte, the exact drink I always ordered, which struck me at the time as thoughtful, and which I would later realize was simply Ryan doing what Ryan always did best, managing an impression. We sat at my kitchen table, the suitcase between us, and for the first 20 minutes, it genuinely was what it appeared to be, a warm, slightly sad afternoon of siblings going through their late father's belongings together. Ryan told a story about the time our father tried to teach him to regulate a balance wheel, and Ryan had dropped an entire tray of tiny screws across the workshop floor, and I laughed for the first time since the funeral, a real laugh, and for a moment I let myself believe that this was simply what it looked like. Then my phone rang, a client rescheduling a Monday appointment, and I stepped into the next room to take the call, glancing back once to see Ryan still sitting at the table, the suitcase open in front of him, sorting through small velvet pouches of tools with what looked like idle curiosity. The call lasted perhaps 4 minutes. When I walked back into the kitchen, something had changed in the room, though it took me a moment to identify what, exactly. The suitcase was closed again, latched, sitting in the same spot on the table. Ryan was leaning back in his chair with his coffee, looking, if anything, slightly too relaxed, the posture of someone performing casualness rather than actually feeling it. I picked the suitcase up to move it aside so we could eat the sandwiches I'd made, and the weight was wrong. I had carried that suitcase from David's office to my car 4 days earlier, and I remembered distinctly how heavy it had felt. The particular density of old steel tools packed into a compact space. What I was holding now felt lighter, hollow in a way that made my stomach drop before my conscious mind had even finished processing the discrepancy. I set it back down slowly. "Ryan," I said, keeping my voice as even as I could manage, "did you take something out of here?" He looked up too quickly, an expression crossing his face that lasted less than a second, but that I recognized instantly. The particular flicker of someone caught mid-thought before they finished constructing their explanation. "No," he said. "Why would I take something out?" I opened the latches. Inside, arranged with a neatness that did not match my father's actual habits, sat a collection of ordinary tools, a few screwdrivers, a loop, a small hammer, nothing that looked wrong exactly, except that I had grown up watching my father organize this exact suitcase 100 times. And something about the arrangement felt staged, unfamiliar, like furniture rearranged in a house you know intimately. "This isn't the same," I said slowly. Ryan's expression shifted into something more defensive. "Of course it's the same, Emma. It's literally the same suitcase you've had for 4 days." I stood there for a moment, running through the last 20 minutes in my mind, and then I remembered something small, something I hadn't consciously registered until that exact moment. When Ryan arrived that morning, he had been carrying, in addition to the 2 coffees, a canvas tote bag looped over one shoulder, the kind of bag you might use to carry gym clothes or groceries. He had set it by the front door when he came in, and I had not thought about it again until right now, standing over a suitcase that felt subtly, unmistakably wrong in my hands. I walked past him toward the front hallway before he could stop me, and there it was, the canvas tote, sitting exactly where he'd left it, heavier than an empty bag should be. I unzipped it in front of him, and inside, nestled in a dish towel that I recognized as one of my own, sat a second leather suitcase, nearly identical to the one on my kitchen table, scuffed corners, dulled brass latches, the kind of close resemblance that only works if you've had time to shop for it specifically, or if you've built it yourself from spare parts. "Ryan," I said, holding up the bag, "what is this?" For a long moment he didn't answer, and in that silence I watched something in my brother's carefully maintained composure finally crack. "It's not what it looks like," he said, which is, I have come to understand, one of the most reliable indicators that something is exactly what it looks like. "Explain it to me then," I said, "because from where I'm standing, it looks like you brought a fake suitcase into my house so you could swap it for the real one while I was on the phone." He set his coffee down harder than necessary. "Fine," he said. "Fine, I was going to swap it, all right. But not to steal from you, Emma. That's not what this is about. There's something in there Dad never should have left to you specifically, something that's actually mine, that I should have gotten instead of you, and I was going to take it and replace it with tools worth about the same as what was already in there so you wouldn't even notice a difference." What I felt in that moment was not simple anger, though anger was certainly present. It was a colder, more focused clarity, the specific feeling of watching a person you love reveal, deliberately and with real planning, that they had decided you were someone who could be managed rather than someone who deserved the truth. "What's actually in there, Ryan?" I asked. "What is worth building an entire fake suitcase over?" He wouldn't answer directly. Not that afternoon. He grabbed his tote bag, muttered something about needing to think, and left without eating the sandwich I'd made him, leaving me standing in my own kitchen with two suitcases, one real and one carefully constructed to deceive me, and a question that would take the better part of the following week to fully answer. I did not call Ryan that night. Instead, I called our father's oldest friend, Frank Miller, a retired jeweler who had known my father for nearly 40 years and had attended the funeral, a small, sharp-eyed man who had once told me, at the reception, that he owed my father more than he could ever properly repay for reasons he never explained. Frank came by the following afternoon, moving slowly with a cane he didn't fully need, and sat at my kitchen table examining the real suitcase with the kind of unhurried attention that made me understand I had not looked closely enough myself. "Your father was a meticulous man," Frank said, lifting each tool out one at a time, examining it, setting it aside in a specific order. "He would not leave you a suitcase of ordinary tools and call it your inheritance. That is not how Robert thought about anything, let alone his own children. He worked slowly through the layers, lifting a felt-lined tray that I had assumed was simply the bottom of the case, revealing a shallow compartment beneath it that I had genuinely never noticed in all my childhood afternoons at that workbench, because my father had never once, in my presence, opened that particular section. Inside the hidden compartment lay a small brass key, unmarked except for a stamped number, 4471, and a folded slip of paper in my father's careful, upright handwriting. "Emma," the note read, "if you are reading this, you have looked past the obvious, which is exactly what I hoped you would eventually do. This key opens box 4471 at Merrick Trust on Delancey Street. What is inside belongs to you, and only you, because you are the only one of my children who never once asked me for anything you hadn't earned yourself. I am sorry I could not say this more plainly while I was alive. Some truths are safer folded into something your brother would never think to look for twice." I sat with that note for a long time, Frank quiet beside me, understanding, I think, more than he was saying out loud. "Do you know what this is about?" I asked him. Frank considered the question carefully before answering. "I know your father worried," he said finally, "about what would happen to certain things if they were simply handed over without protection. He never told me the specifics, but I know he trusted you with something he did not trust your brother with. And I suspect your brother has known, or at least suspected, exactly what that something is for quite some time." That sentence sat with me uneasily for days afterward, because it meant that Ryan's attempted swap had not been an impulsive, desperate act, but the execution of something he had clearly planned in advance, which meant he had known, or strongly suspected, what the suitcase actually contained long before I did. I went to Merrick Trust the following Tuesday, key in hand, Frank insisting on accompanying me as a witness, in case the box's contents needed to be documented properly. The bank employee who walked us back to the vault was polite and unbothered, the kind of routine transaction she had clearly handled hundreds of times. And it was only when the long metal box slid free from its wall compartment that my hands actually started shaking. Inside, wrapped carefully in the same kind of felt my father used to line his watch trays, lay a small collection of vintage timepieces, 4 of them, each in remarkably preserved condition, and beneath the felt, a manila envelope containing paperwork I did not immediately understand, insurance appraisals, correspondence with an auction house, and a handwritten ledger in my father's handwriting spanning nearly a decade. Frank went quiet the moment he saw the watches themselves, his expression shifting from polite curiosity into something closer to genuine astonishment. "Emma," he said carefully, "do you understand what these are?" I told him I didn't. Not really. Beyond recognizing that they were old and clearly valuable in some way, I didn't have the expertise to evaluate. "These are pieces your father acquired over decades," Frank said, turning one over gently in his palm. A slim gold watch with a hand-engraved case. Rare movements, limited production, the kind of pieces collectors spend years searching for. I always assumed he sold most of what came through the shop worth serious money, because that's what he told people. I did not know he'd kept anything like this. The appraisal documents, dated 8 months before my father died, valued the 4 watches combined at just under $400,000. Nearly double what Ryan had received in cash and property. But it was the ledger that explained everything else. The reason my father had hidden this so carefully. The reason he had built an entire deceptive architecture around a simple leather suitcase. The ledger tracked, in my father's precise handwriting, every loan he had given Ryan over the preceding 9 years. Not gifts, as I had always assumed, but loans, each dated, each noting the amount and stated purpose. A car down payment, a failed restaurant investment, 2 collapsed real estate ventures, a gambling debt paid off quietly in cash my father had noted simply as Ryan, urgent, no questions asked, do not mention to Emma. The total, added up across 9 years, came to just over $190,000, money that had never been repaid, money that Ryan had never once mentioned to me in all the years I sat with our father in waiting rooms and quiet evenings, money that explained finally why the $210,000 Ryan received in the will was, according to a final note in my father's handwriting, essentially the same money Ryan had already spent, returned to him one last time so the estate would look even on paper to anyone who never looked closely enough to ask why. He knew, I said quietly, mostly to myself. He knew Ryan had already taken almost everything, and he made sure I got what was actually left. Frank nodded slowly. "Your father did not believe in public confrontation," he said. "He believed in quiet architecture, in making sure the truth existed somewhere solid, even if he never said it out loud himself." I drove home that afternoon with the manila envelope on the passenger seat where the suitcase had once sat, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but a strange, steadying combination of both, the sense of finally understanding a shape that had been hidden from me my entire life. Ryan called that evening, his voice tighter than before, clearly having spent several days working up to the conversation. "Did you find it?" he asked without preamble. I told him I had. There was a long silence on the line before he spoke again, his voice smaller now, stripped of the performative warmth from the coffee run and the fake condolences at the kitchen table. "I need that money, Emma," he said. "I have debts, real ones, people who are not patient about this kind of thing, and I thought, if I could just get the watches before you even knew what they were, I could sell them quietly and handle everything without anyone else needing to know how bad it actually got." "How bad did it actually get?" I asked. Another silence, longer this time. "Bad enough that Ashley doesn't fully know either," he admitted. "Bad enough that I've been putting off calls I really can't put off much longer." I felt the old familiar instinct to fix things for my brother, to smooth over the discomfort, the way I had watched my father quietly do for 9 years without ever telling me. I recognized the shape of that instinct clearly now, because I had just spent an afternoon reading documentary proof of exactly where it led. "I'm not giving you the watches, Ryan," I said. "Dad already gave you your share, years ago, in pieces, every time you called him with an emergency. This is what's left after that, and it's mine." "That's not fair," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're going to let me actually lose everything over this?" I sat with that question for a moment, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a reflexive one. "I'm not the one who spent 9 years borrowing money you never planned to repay," I said finally. "I'm not the one who tried to swap out a dead man's tools with a fake suitcase, because you'd already decided, on your own, that whatever was hidden inside belonged to you more than it belonged to me. I'm sorry you're in trouble. I mean that. But I'm not going to fix a problem you built by taking from someone who already gave you everything he had." He hung up without saying anything else, and for several days, silence sat between us, heavier than any argument could have been. The following week, I met with an estate attorney, Rachel Stevens, who reviewed the ledger and appraisal documents and confirmed what Frank had already suspected, that the watches constituted a clean, legally documented inheritance entirely separate from the estate Ryan had received, protected by my father's careful planning years in advance. I made a decision that surprised even me. I did not sell all 4 watches, though the money would have changed my life considerably. I kept one, a slim gold piece with my father's own tiny maintenance mark still visible under magnification, a watch he had personally restored twice over the years. I sold the remaining 3 through the auction house named in his correspondence, using the proceeds for something I had quietly wanted for longer than I admitted to myself, leasing a small storefront 2 blocks from where my father's original shop once stood, converting the front half into a massage and yoga studio, and the back half into a workbench space where I began, slowly, teaching myself the craft my father had once offered to teach me directly. Ryan and I are not close now, not in the way we once pretended to be. He eventually told Ashley the full scope of his debts, and the 2 of them worked out a long repayment plan with the people he owed, selling the house he'd inherited to cover the worst of it, a decision that told me, more clearly than any apology could, exactly how serious things had become. He called me once more, several months later, not to ask for anything, which was, in its own way, the most honest conversation we'd had in years. He told me he understood now why our father had done what he did, that he had spent a long time being angry about the suitcase, before finally admitting to himself that the anger had never really been about tools or watches at all, but about finally being asked to face consequences he had spent 9 years successfully avoiding. "I don't expect you to forgive me quickly," he said. "I just wanted you to know I finally get it." I told him I appreciated that, and I meant it, though I also understood that understanding and trust are not the same thing, and that rebuilding the second would take considerably longer than admitting to the first. I still keep my father's real suitcase in the back room of my studio, filled now with the actual tools he left me, the ones I use most weekends, slowly relearning a craft I had loved as a child and never let myself claim as my own. Clients sometimes ask about the old case sitting among yoga mats and massage oils, and I tell them simply that it belonged to my father, and that it turned out to be worth considerably more than anyone in my family understood at the time, myself included. I wear his watch every day now, the slim gold one with his careful maintenance mark still visible if you look closely enough, and some mornings, winding it before I open the studio, I think about that quiet evening months before he died, his hand patting mine, his voice telling me to give things time before deciding what they meant. He was right in the end, the way he was right about almost everything, quietly, without ever needing to raise his voice to prove it. The suitcase everyone assumed was an insult turned out to be the truest inheritance my father ever gave me. Not because of what was hidden inside it, though that mattered too, but because of what it required me to become in order to find it. Patient, careful, willing to look past the obvious, exactly the way he always hoped I would. That, more than any number written on any appraisal document, is the thing I actually carry with me now.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.